Good morning. I would like to share with you the art progress that I made yesterday. But first, I would like to share with you my bedtime reading. Now, I like to read all different types of comics, from newspaper comics, comic books, uh, manga, things old and new. And one one type of comic that I enjoy quite a bit are the classic newspaper comics, such as Pogo by Walt Kelly. Now, Pogo was interesting because he actually started out as a comic book character, and then he moved to the newspapers. I believe he started in the comic books around 1942, and then the comic strip ran from 48 to 1973. So I think there was a transition period when he was in both uh, comic books and in the newspapers. Anyway, this book reprints the earliest of the Pogo stories in the comic books. I'll just show a couple of pictures. I was reading this last night. Um, this is as Pogo appeared in the newspapers. Now, there's going to be a difference here in the comic book. Pogo, in his kind of art journey, becomes a lot cuter, a lot more round. Really, in some ways, Pogo is analogous to Mickey Mouse. If you look at the early Mickey Mouse cartoons, um, and then compare that to, let's say, Mickey by the time of Fantasia. Mickey becomes a lot cuter. He looks more like a little boy. Is in biology we would call that neoteny. But anyway, so the earlier Pogo comic book version is more, I would say, in an illustrative style, rather than in a purely cartoony style. Um, now, Walt Kelly had was trained by Disney, and we will see his influence later on, especially as we go through months and years of these comics. But for now, I just wanted to give a very brief overview. In Pogo's earliest adventures, we uh, we have a narrator, we have lowercase lettering, and it is more like an illustrated picture book than the style that we will see later on. Now, one thing that I would like to point out is that in a reproduction like this, this is basically a perfect platonic version of how the comic book would have appeared. I have a different book that actually reproduces how the books actually looked when they were produced, and the um, the coloring is imperfect. You can see the dots in it. The paper is usually not white. It's usually in off white. Well, it was newsprint. But for a book like this, they've made it basically the best version that it could have been if it had been printed on nice book paper like this, nice archival paper. Now, one thing that I don't know is, well, one, did Kelly himself do the lettering? I'm going to assume yes, but I don't know that for a fact. And lettering is a whole conversation. I could talk about that for hours. And the other thing is the colors themselves. Did Kelly pick these colors, or was there a separate department for that? I wonder about that because in the newspaper comics, he actually turned in black and white line art, and for the Sundays, he had printing instructions for where the colors would go. And I don't know whether that was the same system for these comic books. This was actually not uncommon for comic strips. Um, for instance, Charles Schultz never handed in a colored comic. He just had printing instructions, and I'm sure that was for most of the major newspaper comic strips. Certainly, that was the case for Bill Watterson, although I don't know whether that was the case for Watterson's later works when he had a larger canvas for his Sunday comics. So this is an enlargement of a newspaper panel. This is much bigger than Kelly would have drawn it. If you look closely, you can see the blue lines. That would have been actually a pencil like this, whatever the 1940s brand would have been. And that's because it wouldn't have shown up when this was made into a plate. Now, one thing I do find interesting is if you look carefully at the blue lines, you'll see that they are not very detailed. Kelly just did sort of a very rough outline of where his characters needed to be, and then he improvised the details like the fur and some of this cross hatching here. And if you look at these black marks on the bottom, the shadows, you can see now I can't tell whether those are pen strokes or brush strokes, but you can see that they are imperfect in the sense that, if one were to do a watercolor, one would smooth this out and try to make it uniform. Now, the reason Kelly didn't bother about that is because when this was made into a plate, this would have read as pure black. And so this was just a way to save time. This does bring up kind of an interesting, almost philosophical issue with comic art as to what exactly the original is, because when one looks at the original item that Kelly brought in, it's not really a comic that we read as a story. It's more of a document of an art journey. So this isn't what you would really want in the book. This isn't sort of your perfect form of the comic in a way. Anyway, I'm just going to show a couple more images before I show you my art work from yesterday. One more point that I would like to bring up is that these were children's comics. This is around probably 1942 or at least the early 40s. And children's comics were, of course, very popular back then. Back then, children really just had the radio. If they lived in a city, they would have a matinee and of course lots and lots of outdoor games. So comics filled the void that television would have filled, the internet, video games, all things like that. And when we see a comic book like this, I can easily imagine, a child might scrounge up some money and he could read this and share it with his siblings and friends, and something like this would have been read, an issue like this was probably read by many children, but because this was on pulp paper, the parents wouldn't save it. This was also during the war, so there were paper drives. Essentially, paper was being gathered up to be recycled and used for the war effort. So many comic books of this time period did not survive. I really like the locomotive on this page. There is a lot of character to that. Anyway, I could talk about Pogo for hours and hours. But for now, I'm just going to leave off with one last thought. This is as far as I got to reading last night, the story with the deer. And that this comic, the dialogue is written in sort of a vaudevillian Southern dialect. And this is an element of comics which we've mostly lost, the wordplay and dialect play. We have to keep in mind that the time period when comics like this were made. So, obviously vaudeville was a big thing at the turn of the century. But also keep in mind that, radio was a newfangled technology for the 20s and 30s. So when Walt Kelly was a child, people were still reading aloud a great deal of material. People were reading aloud short stories to each other and reading aloud comics. This is a reason why, for instance, if you take a pulp story, like something by Lovecraft or Edgar Rice Burroughs, many times a story like that is a better performance than it is a story on the page. I think Lovecraft is read aloud very well, and although I don't know for a fact whether people were widely reading him aloud, the way it is written lends itself to a performance. And so, a child in the 1940s, I think, would not have had any trouble reading this dialect. Delicious, my child. Um, I obviously can't read this aloud very well, but I don't think children back then would have had a lot of difficulty with that. Now, the advantage of this dialect is that Kelly is able to throw in wordplay and puns and do many very interesting things with the language. This is a very literate comic, a very literate children's comic back then, and in a way that we don't really have a lot nowadays. This is as far as I got, so I'm going to close here. There is a lot to be said about the writing style of these comics. The story is very compressed as opposed to manga. I don't really have any access to children's manga at this time period, but certainly in the contemporary manga, all ages manga that I have read, stories tend to be expanded a great deal. So, for instance, this amount of dialogue would not be in one page, but maybe 2 pages, and they would be more transitions between the scenes, more facial expressions, and the like. And anyway, we can talk more about Pogo at another time. In the meanwhile, let's see what I did yesterday. Okay, so yesterday I had almost finished this page. I had done stippling work, but I just needed to do some cross-hatching and detail design. This is a page where a monster comes up from under the bed, and the teddy bear is going to defend these children against the monster. So I finished that page, and then I penciled and inked this page and filled in the blacks and everything. This was kind of a fairly simple page. For the monster, the only idea I had was really just a shape. So kind of a shape of tentacles and eyes. And also, I want to do sort of an homage to the Adam West Batman era. So, pow, punch, curse blood, and wham. And there are no borders, but the words and sort of the eyes of the creatures tell you where the reader's eye is supposed to go. And then I finished the line art for this page, and I just need to fill in the blacks, do some stippling, and some details. On this page, I decided that to show a whole bunch of different types of monsters. So we have some things that are shapes, and then some things that look like jaws, and some type of walking creature, and creatures that are like amoebae or like ghosts, and something that's a little bit like a skull, and just sort of these abstract shapes just sort of read as monsters or nightmarish things, but still very kind of cute. My style goes towards the cute. Even the monsters are cute. And then there's only one more page left in this little short story, and I've just sort of blocked out some panels. And I hope that I will finish these pages today, because then I can start working on this book. And this is going to take a lot of planning. But anyway, I will keep you informed on progress on this. So, goodbye.